that I talked a little bit about a conversation that Christy and I had the last day really that we were together. And Christy had always told me that she wanted to be cremated, but we had never really talked about what she wanted done with the remains after she was cremated. So our last day together, the morning I got to the hospital, I said, sweetie, we've not really talked about what you want me to do once you are cremated. So she had a difficult time talking because her breathing was so compromised. So I just said to her, I'll give you some options, and then you squeeze my hand when it's the one that you want. So I said to her, do you want me to take the urn and bury it somewhere, back home in Illinois or up in Tennessee or here in Florida somewhere? Or do you want me to take the ashes and spread them somewhere that you really love, like the mountains in Tennessee or Hawaii or something like that? Or do you want me to find a mausoleum somewhere? So none of those options. And then I finally said, or do you want me to just keep them at home? And that's the one that she wanted. And then she looked up to me and she smiled and she said, to bother you. So she has been bothering me because I didn't know exactly what to do with the urn and with the display that I wanted to create. But I finally kind of got it all sort of worked out. And as you can imagine, it's something very special to me. I put it in my office, which is the part of the house where I stay the most often, and I put it right next to my desk, so it's just always right there next to me. And I'll tell you, if somebody broke into my house and stole my computer or stole my TV or stole anything else, I'd be upset. But if somebody came in and stole that urn, I would be devastated because it's the remains of a person I loved dearly. The reason I bring that up is because here in John chapter 20, that is exactly how this chapter starts. It's the visit of someone who has lost someone who meant a great deal to them, who has come to visit his grave, to pay respects, and even to help to anoint his body, only to find that the body is missing. So I want you to turn with me to John chapter 20 this morning and look at the way the Bible presents to us the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And that story begins with the visit of Mary Magdalene to the tomb. So verse 1 says this, now on the first day of the week. Now right off the bat, we need to pause and remind ourselves of a couple of points of reference in terms of time. The first day of the week. Do you remember back in John chapter 2 where John records the cleansing of the temple, that Jesus said to the Jewish leaders who opposed his action, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Jesus was put to death on Friday. We have just seen the passing of the Sabbath, and now we have come to the third day. So the fact that John tells us that what happens here takes place on the first day of the week is part of his way of reminding us this is exactly when Jesus said this would happen. But the other thing it reminds us of is the very beginning of the gospel, which begins with the beginning, right? In the beginning was the Word. Language, of course, designed to evoke the very beginning of the Bible itself, the story of creation. And of course, it's a silly question, but what day does creation begin on? The first day of the week. And so John, by telling us that it's the first day of the week, is first of all reminding us of the very time frame Jesus gave for his resurrection. But secondly, is calling our attention to creation. That what's going to take place here in John chapter 20 is a new creation, a new beginning. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's continue on. Verse 1 says, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. I'm not exactly sure why, but when I was a kid, I thought Mary Magdalene was a prostitute who had become a follower of Jesus. The text doesn't say that. Swinging wildly to the other extreme, some of you who remember the mid-2000s remember the Da Vinci Code craze, in which the author of that book said that Mary Magdalene was, in fact, the wife of Jesus. There's even less evidence for that. If you want to know her backstory, all you got to do is flip back to the Gospel of Luke and take a look at the opening verses of the 8th chapter. Luke chapter 8 tells us that in the company of Jesus and the disciples was a group of women who helped to financially support them. Luke chapter 8 says in verse 1, soon afterward he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. And number one on the list, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. 7 demons. Now, if you're familiar with the Gospels at all, you're familiar with stories of demonic activity, of unclean spirits, and Jesus casting them out. And you remember in those stories the terrible things that unclean spirits would do to their victims, the shrieking and the screaming, the fact that sometimes they would do harm to themselves when a person was afflicted with an unclean spirit. Well, if that's what one unclean spirit did, imagine what 7 of them would do. No wonder then Mary Magdalene was such a loyal and dedicated follower of Jesus. No wonder she's a part of the group that helps to support his ministry. No wonder when you come to John's gospel, she's one of the women mentioned as being at the foot of the cross of Jesus. And no wonder here in John chapter 20, she is so anxious to get to the tomb of her beloved master, the one who had freed her from such terrible evil and from such terrible suffering. And so John 20 goes on to tell us in verse 1 that what she saw made her heart sink. She saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him. I think I should point out that it's really striking here that when Mary, a follower of Jesus, a beloved follower of Jesus, comes to the tomb and sees that it is empty, her first response is not, hallelujah, Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. I'm making this point because there are some skeptics who think, well, you know, these ancient people, they were kind of ignorant and superstitious. They didn't know a lot about modern medical technology, and so they were kind of gullible, and they would believe things like resurrection from the dead. Well, ancient people may not have known everything that we know, but they knew dead people don't just spontaneously rise from the dead. That's why when Mary shows up at the tomb, her immediate reaction is not, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. Her immediate reaction is, somebody has gotten into this tomb and done something with his body. Ancient people knew just like we do that dead bodies do not come back to life on their own. But what we believe as Christians is that dead bodies don't come back to life on their own, but if there is a God who is the creator and sustainer of the world, if there is a God in whom we live and move and have our very being, if there is a God who upholds all things by the word of his power, if there is a God that intimately involved in the ordinary course of creation, then that God also by the word of his power could cause extraordinary things to happen, like a resurrection. Well, let's go back here to the text. She goes and tells Simon Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. Where was Peter the last time we saw him in this gospel? Well, he's in the courtyard of the high priest, denying Jesus. And I think it's important to point out, I'm not sure that I did when I preached on that text, that at least John, unlike the other disciples who ran away, was interested enough, concerned enough, that he came back around to at least see how things were going to pan out in the life of Jesus. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, we learned back in chapter 19, returned from the shadows to be present there at the crucifixion of Jesus. So it's these two men, the leader of the disciples and the beloved disciple of Jesus, that Mary seeks out for help. And that leads us to the second scene John presents to us in this gospel. And that's when Peter and John see the empty tomb. Verse 3 says, so Peter went out with the other disciples, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. A lot of running in this chapter. Did you notice that? Mary runs to the disciples run to the tomb, and one outruns the other. The disciple whom Jesus loved outruns Peter. You would be amazed through the years at some of the theories critical scholarship has developed on just that one simple basic point. Some have conjectured that this is John's attempt to show that the early church was divided into the Peter church, the Petrine church, and the churches under John's control, the Johannine church, and that John outruns Peter to show that his churches are outstripping Peter's churches. That's actually a serious theory. Other people think that this shows that John must have been quite a bit younger and therefore quicker and outran Peter. Although that's not necessarily true that those who are younger are quicker. I mean, I'm younger than Mike Ross. I mean, way younger than Mike Ross. But Mike Ross is faster than me. I mean, way faster than me. So it's not true that just because you're younger, you're going to outrun people. So I want to tell you my astonishing theory as to why the disciple whom Jesus loved outran Peter. And here it is. Brace yourselves for this. He was faster. That's my theory that I present to you this morning. So he was faster, but Peter was bolder. Because verse 5 says, stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. In this part of the world, caves were often used for tombs because you've already got this naturally cut out space. Most likely, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea looked very much like what this picture is portraying here, something that was taking advantage of a natural cave-like structure. And of course, these caves with their sealed entrances would protect the departed bodies from scavenging animals and also from grave robbers. Notice, though, that when Peter and John look into the tomb, that they spell out for us in great detail what they saw. Linen cloths and a face cloth. We were already told at the end of chapter 19 about the details of Jesus' burial, that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus came and wrapped him in linen cloths and anointed him with oil and spices. So the fact that Peter and John can look into the tomb and see these grave clothes laying there tells us something very important. A couple of things, actually. Number one, it tells us that whatever happened to the body, it was not stolen by grave robbers. Grave robbers would not have bothered to take the time to carefully unwrap the body before they took it out of the tomb. They would have been urgent and working quickly and would have taken everything out and then unwrapped it later somewhere else. So that's the first thing this detail indicates to us, is this is not a question of grave robbery, but there's something far more significant here. This isn't the first time in John's gospel we've seen reference to linen cloths and a face cloth as a part of a burial. We saw this back in chapter 11 in the case of the resurrection or raising of Lazarus. But I want to point something out to you that's very different in John 11 as compared to John chapter 20. In John chapter 11 and verse 43, when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, verse 44 says, the man who died came out, listen to this, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And then Jesus says, unbind him. Here's what I want you to notice. In the case of the raising of Lazarus, he was still wrapped up in these linen strips of cloth. And his face cloth was still wrapped around his head. And somebody else had to unbind him and free him from those. But that was not the case with Jesus. Whatever happened to Jesus, it wasn't as if he needed somebody else to unwrap him. Instead, it's quite the opposite. It's almost as if something so dramatic changed here in the tomb that these cloths just simply fell off. And that, in fact, his face cloth, the Bible says, is wrapped up. I think the New American Standard Bible says is folded up. It's almost like somebody took the face cloth off of themselves and then folded up to almost say, won't need that anymore. In other words, this isn't merely the resuscitation of a corpse. Like in the case of Lazarus, this is something much different. Something has happened here that has radically transformed the body of Jesus, such that he is able just simply to pass through cloths. just like maybe you could pass through walls. In other words, what has happened here is exactly what Jesus said in John 10 when he talked about being the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep and says, I lay my life down and I will take it up again. No one had to help Jesus out of that tomb. Now, I don't know what Peter thought about this, but I do know what John thought about it. Verse 8 says, Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. John sees, and on the basis of this evidence, the lack of a body but the presence of the grave cloths, he believes that Jesus has risen from the dead, even though at this point, as verse 9 goes on to say, he doesn't understand that this is what the Scriptures said would happen. I think that's another thing for us to consider as we contemplate the stories of the resurrection of Jesus that are found in the Gospels. Think about it like this. If this did not really happen, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, where did these early Christians come up with this story? First of all of these Christians are Jewish. All of the disciples are Jewish. And while we do know that among the Pharisees there was the belief that there would be a general resurrection of the dead at the end of history, there had never been a Pharisee, there had never been a Jewish teacher of any sort who had ever suggested that not just simply at the end of history, but in the very middle of history, the Messiah would die and be raised from the dead. Nobody had ever suggested that until the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. So they couldn't have borrowed this simply from a Jewish story, nor could they have borrowed it from a Greco-Roman story, because we know that pagans did not even believe in the idea of the resurrection. Do you remember what happened in Acts 17 when Paul was speaking to the philosophers in Athens, and he's telling them about the God that they do not know and who has revealed himself in creation? As soon as Paul shifts to the subject of the resurrection, how did they respond? Some began to mock him because they thought the notion of a bodily resurrection was absurd. So what I'm saying to you is this: where would the early Christians have ever come up with such an idea? It's not a Jewish idea of the Messiah dying and being raised to life. It's not a Greco-Roman idea of the Messiah dying and being raised to life. What I want to suggest for you is the reason they came up with this story is because it is what happened to everybody's astonishment and amazement. It wasn't as if they had all of these passages from the Old Testament that clearly spelled out, hey, the Messiah is going to come and die and be raised from the dead. And then they said, okay, let's see how we can get the details of Jesus' life to fit those passages. It is, in fact, exactly the reverse. To their utter amazement, Jesus died and rose again, and they said, that's got to be in the Old Testament somewhere. And then they went back, and then they could see it. But it was much more like, for example, if you ever saw the movie The Sixth Sense, which is a pretty mysterious movie until you come to the amazing secret ending, which I won't give away, in case there's like a couple of you haven't seen it yet. But then when you go back and you rewatch the movie, then it all makes total sense. But it did not make sense until the revelation at the end. That's how the resurrection of Jesus works. It's an event that only made sense of the Scriptures because it happened, which is exactly, of course, why these writers are telling us the story. But maybe the most surprising detail in this account is what it says in verse 10. Then the disciples went back to their homes. Like, wait a minute, at least John believes Jesus has risen from the dead. Maybe Peter, but certainly John does. And your response to that is, oh, let's go back home. But it also could be that because this has been such a revolutionary, world-upturning event, they're just going to need some time to let it sink in. But while Peter and John returned back to where they were staying, Mary Magdalene's going to reappear. After all, for her, the emergency is still in view. The body of her loved one is still gone, and nobody knows what happened. So that leads us to the third scene in this gospel, when Mary sees Jesus. Verse 11. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. One of the things the text emphasizes is her profound sorrow. It mentions her crying in verse 11, mentions it again in verse 13, mentions it again in verse 15. Her heart's broken. She is crushed. But Mary is about to learn exactly what Jesus had told the disciples just a few days prior they would all learn. When he said to them in chapter 16 and verse 20, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy." Well, through her tears, Mary sees something amazing in the tomb. Verse 12, she saw two angels in white. It doesn't necessarily look as if Mary recognized them as such in the text, but what John tells us is they were heavenly messengers, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. It almost reminds you of the Ark of the Covenant, doesn't it? Where there were two angels astride the presence of God. They ask her in verse 13, "Woman, madam, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." But at that moment, she must have heard something behind her, because verse 14 says, having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Everybody wants to know why in these gospel resurrection stories, people don't immediately, as a general rule, recognize the risen Lord. Mary doesn't immediately recognize him here. In the next chapter, there's going to be a story where the disciples don't recognize him. In Luke's account, the disciples on the road to Emmaus don't recognize him, at least at first. And I don't have all the answers. I'm not sure it's always the same issue in each case. I think part of it is the last time they had seen Jesus, his body was in a mangled state. And now here he is transformed. I think maybe even more to the point, none of them were expecting to see him, because he was dead and none of them had expected him to be raised from the dead. So of course it would be unexpected. I don't know about you. I'm one of those people that if I see someone that I know, and in fact I might know them really well, but if I see them somewhere I was not expecting to see them, I don't recognize them. And on the other hand, if I'm expecting to see somebody, I imagine I see them even when I don't. So that's why at lectures, so often I have gone up to people and given them a big hug only to realize it was a total stranger. I just don't say hi to anybody now. You know, if they want to say hi to me, they can come say hi to me. But I just keep my head down and move right on here. So maybe it's some of those issues involved. But her confusion continues in verse 15. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Who are you seeking? Now, you would have to have a great memory to remember when this sermon series started back a few months ago, that in the opening chapter of the Gospel of John, the very first words recorded by Jesus are the words that he spoke in a question to two of John the Baptist's followers when he says to them in chapter 1 and verse 38, "What are you seeking?" And now, his first words after his resurrection are, "Who are you seeking?" Jesus came to seek and save the lost. From first to last in this gospel, Jesus is seeking people who are seeking him. He's seeking you this very morning, as a matter of fact. So he says to Mary, "Who are you seeking?" And verse 15 goes on to say, supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, let me know where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Now, we already learned at the end of chapter 19 that Joseph's tomb was in a garden. She thinks she's talking to the caretaker of the grounds here, and he may have done something temporarily with the body. And I pointed out to you last week that it is quite appropriate that since the story of man's sin and rebellion and downfall takes place in a garden, that now the story of man's salvation and redemption will also take place in a garden. And after all, what was Adam's occupation in Genesis? He's a gardener, right? And so now the gardener, the second Adam, is going to undo and reverse what the first gardener had done. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. If we were reading this in the original language, he actually says the word Miriam, the Jewish form of her name. And there was something about the way he addressed her, the tone, the accent, the name itself, that unmistakably identified this as her teacher, her rabbi, her Rabboni. But there's one reason above all others that at this point, Mary recognizes the voice of Jesus. What did Jesus say about his sheep in chapter 10? My sheep know my voice. And when I call my sheep by name, they follow me because they know my voice. Jesus has called his sheep by name. And now she knows the good shepherd's voice and follows him. Can you imagine the sheer joy that must have swept over her? I mean, think about it. She would have been very happy had she just simply found his corpse. Because this body of her loved one, she can now tend after and look after and show her honor and respect to. That would have been enough for her as this story started. But instead, she's gotten so much more. She has her living Lord back. And based on verse 17, she must have done what any of us would have done, grabbed hold of him. Because in verse 17, Jesus said, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Now, it's another puzzling passage here, right? Don't cling to me. Jesus like have personal bubble issues. No, hey, let's keep back here. Is that what it is? No, I don't think so. He lets people touch him all the time. He let people kill him. And there's not a problem really with him being touched. In principle, in the next chapter, in the next story, he's going to actually demand of Thomas, lay your hands on me, touch the wounds. So exactly what's going on here, I'm not sure. Some commentators think that the point that Jesus is making is, hey, look, our relationship has changed and it's going to be different, and I'm not going to be here forever, so don't get used to this. I'm going to go ascend to the Father. That's what he says at the end of verse 17. The other way to look at this, though, is that Jesus is saying, hey, look, I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. I'm going to be here for a while longer, so you don't have to hang on to me as if I'm immediately leaving. There's going to be some time here before I go back to the Father. In any event, Jesus gives her an important commission at the end of verse 17. Go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Now, throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus has talked about the Father a lot. But it has always been the Father who sent me, or my Father. And Jesus has called his followers different things. He's called them disciples and servants and friends. But now he says, call my brothers. And now it's not just simply the Father or my Father. Now it is my Father and your Father, my God and your God, as if something has decisively changed now, not only for Jesus in his resurrection, but also for all of his followers, that now through him and through what he's done, we can enjoy a relationship with God far more intimate and personal than we would have ever imagined. And so in verse 18, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And then he said these things to her. Let me make one more point in favor of the truthfulness of this account. In the Gospels, like here in the case of John, it is a woman, Mary Magdalene, who is the first witness to the empty tomb, and who is the first witness of the risen Lord. That is certainly not what we would have expected. We would have naturally expected one of the disciples, like Peter and John, for example, to be the initial witness. But it was a woman, Mary Magdalene. The reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because in the ancient world, there was such a patronizing view of women that in typical legal circles, the testimony of women was not even considered legitimate in a court of law. As a matter of fact, the 2nd century critic Celsus dismissed Mary as a hysterical female. So here's the point I want you to consider. If you were to argue that the gospel writers simply made these stories up, it didn't really happen. If you were going to make up a story in that day and time, why would you invent as your primary witness of the two most important facts about the truthfulness of the resurrection, the empty tomb and the appearance of Jesus? Why would you invent out of whole cloth a person whose testimony your own culture would say should not be listened to? Isn't it much more likely that the Gospels are telling us that Mary Magdalene was the first witness of the empty tomb and the risen Lord, because as embarrassing and awkward and uncomfortable as that truth may be, it is what happened, and what they're interested in is telling us what happened despite how awkward it may be. What I think is so cool here about this story is that Mary Magdalene, in essence, becomes the apostle to the apostles. Remember, apostle means one sent on a commission, and she's now been sent by Jesus to the apostles to tell them about the resurrection. All through this story, what really stands out is Mary's persistence. She was going to go to the tomb to pay respects to her friend. When she can't find him, she doesn't give up. She runs to find the apostles to tell them what happened. Then she doesn't stop there. She goes back to the tomb and looks some more. When she doesn't recognize Jesus at first, she persists. She just keeps on pursuing Jesus. And then when she finds him, she finds something greater than she could have ever imagined. And that's true of all of us. Jesus is seeking us. We need to seek him. And if we seek him persistently, if we seek him not giving up, if we seek him, we will find him. And it will be much greater than we could have ever imagined. Now, before we leave this part of the story, I think it's important to measure the significance of what's happened here in light of what we were already told by Jesus in this gospel. According to Jesus, when he spoke with the disciples in the upper room and on the walk to the garden, he was very clear about why what was going to happen was about to take place. Let me remind you of a couple of things he said. If you turn back to chapter 15, in verse 18, Jesus says this: "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you." Jesus says the world, the rebellious realm of sinful humanity, hates me. That's why this is going to happen. They're going to hate you like they hate me. Not only that, he says they're going to hate those who come after. Verse 19, "If you were of the world would love you as its own, but because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world hates you." In fact, if you go to verse 24, he says the world hates the Father. 15:24, "If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. But now they've seen and hated both me and my Father." So Jesus is telling them what's about to happen here is the hatred of the world is about to be unleashed. And he also said this hatred is being spearheaded by the ruler of this world, who he talked about in chapter 14 and verse 30, when he said, the ruler of this world is coming. So if you think of the cross and the death of Jesus, what you are seeing is what happens when the world, seething in hatred, led by the nefarious evil one, conspires to do their very worst against Jesus. And guess what happened? Even when the world in its sinful hatred, led by the devil, does its very worst against Jesus, Jesus conquered and overcame. Do you remember what he said in chapter 12 and verse 31? When he came into the city of Jerusalem at the start of that final week, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out." What you need to know, what we've just read today in John 20 tells us is that Jesus Christ overcomes. He overcomes the sinful, evil hatred of the world. That Jesus Christ has triumphantly conquered even the very evil one himself. And it gives us all the very assurance to know that as we must go against the world and its evil one, that through Jesus Christ, greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And ultimately, that's what Peter and John and Mary all are going to discover through this empty tomb and through their risen Lord. And that's what we want to make sure all of you have embraced as well. And the Bible teaches that we enter this very story of the death and resurrection of Jesus through our faith in Christ and being baptized into him, being baptized, as Paul says in Romans 6, into his death and then raised to new life. And if you're a child of God, I hope you will be encouraged and emboldened in your faith to know the victory that is yours through Christ who has overcome. And if we can help anybody